That's the most important question. How come you haven't sent more deals to our firm? Hopefully by the time I'm finished today, you will think about adding me as one of the lawyers when you give out names so that I can give a quote as well. I've given you the presentation, so everything that I'm putting on the board, I've given you in the handout. And as Sammy has said, I have written books for realtors, buyers, sellers, and I've written a special book for landlords as well in Ontario. And so if you haven't taken a course with me before, I've been a real estate lawyer for 35 years. And I've written these books. I've been on every news program as a real estate expert when the TV people want to ask me a question about real estate. I've written columns in the Toronto Star and Real Estate Magazine on real estate, and I'm a senior partner. Our firm is realestatelawyers.ca, and you see our brochure where we have a car on the front, and also you see that I've given you $100 gift cards that you can give to clients for your first 3 deals that you refer, and the client will get $100 off our regular fee to do that. And as Sammy said, my books are available, just $20 each at the end of the seminar. And if you don't have any cash, I even brought my little Visa debit machine so you can click or tap for that as well. And a little bit about our firm. You'll see on the back of the brochure, the front has the prices, so you see the prices are very competitive. My accounting department has only Chinese clerks, so we can speak to your clients about the most important thing, which is money. How much money are they going to get when the deal closes, or how much money and how to transfer it to our accounts. So we handle many, many Chinese clients, both here or abroad. And the biggest difference between our firm and many others is we go to the client home to sign the papers so that the client never has to miss work. We go in the evening, we go on the weekend. Whenever, if it's convenient for the client, we go to their home to sign the papers. And we close deals now all across Ontario. So I can close a deal all the way to London, Niagara Falls, up to Muskoka, and lately we've opened up in Ottawa, Windsor, and Sudbury, because we have people there who can go to the client and sign the papers. I can register and supervise everything from my laptop right here or in the office. And one of the problems we've seen with buyers is that on the day of closing, they have to go run to their bank, get a bank draft, and then go run to their lawyer's office to close the deal. We make it very simple for buyers. We do not accept a bank draft or a certified check. Instead, we open the trust account at every bank. So this way, the client just goes to their branch. It could be CIBC, TD, it doesn't matter. They go to the branch, we give them instructions, and they just transfer the money from their account to my account. Like they're paying a Bell bill online. It costs no money. And they can do it the day, 2 days, the evening before closing without any stress. Many clients use HSBC. HSBC is just an exception. We have an HSBC branch near our office, and so we have to go ourselves. We send somebody to pick up the draft. Again, the client doesn't have to do anything except arrange the money transfer. And this is also good for sellers because we pay the sellers the same way. We transfer the money electronically into their account, an EFT. You see, when you transfer the money EFT, the bank doesn't hold the money. When a lawyer puts a certified check in the client account, the bank could hold it for a week to 10 days. They don't hold our money. So sellers like that we transfer the money automatically to them. And this is how we deposit commission too. So you never have to come to my office to pick up a commission check because we deposit it immediately into your commission trust account the morning after closing. How many of you are like that? That's when you get paid right away. And also, if the deal, let's say, gets registered today at 1 o'clock, the agent is notified 1 minute later that the deal has closed? How many of you like that, to be notified by email immediately when your deal closes, whether you're a buyer or a seller agent? So you never have to call me at 5 o'clock. Mark, did my deal close today? You already know. I already know because the email is sent out. So this is why we do this, to make it more efficient for buyers, sellers, and agents. We have 35 locations you see on the back of the folder, but that's mostly so that buyers can pick up keys at one of our offices after closing. And I'm available always to answer your email questions. So as Sammy said, if you have a question about anything, just send me an email. I don't charge for this advice. I'm there to help. I've also helped a lot of agents by reviewing status certificates before a bidding war. So let's say you want to put in an offer tonight on a condominium without a condition, and you have a status certificate. I will review it, and I will not charge. Even if the client does not win, I will not charge. I do this as a favor for you, so that you can tell the client, I can review your status certificate before a bidding war, so they have a better chance to win. I also don't charge to review pre-construction condos or homes. So we do that as well, and we don't charge for that. So you see, we're there, and I'm there, and I already had to answer a whole bunch of questions on residential tenancies this morning. Almost every question you have is in my residential landlord guide that it sells for $50 on my website, but I'm only selling it for $20 today after the class. Okay, so we're going to start right away with the new lease, and I'm going to teach you exactly how to do the new lease. How many of you have seen the new lease, the government lease? Okay, is this lease for the tenant or for the landlord? Who do you think benefits more from the government lease? The tenant. Yes, no question the tenant benefits, because now the tenant understands all their rights. Before, they didn't really understand all the rights. So landlords do not like the government lease, but as of right now, you have to use it. You have to use the government lease. So you know that. You're supposed to use it now, unless you have a lease that started last year and is just renewing month to month. So if it's just renewing month to month, you do not need the new lease. You can stay month to month under whatever lease that you have. But they changed Offer 400. That's the big change. So Offer 400 used to say that if the tenant and landlord never signed the lease, the offer would be the lease. And this is how most people used 400. This was the lease. But now we have to do more. You have to do more because it's been changed. So now it says on 400, the landlord will prepare the government lease, and it's going to be signed by the tenant and the landlord before they move in. So you see now, please, there's some chairs still here. Now you see there's two steps you have to do if you're doing a lease. How many of you do leases here in the room? Okay, a lot of you do this. So the first step is the same as before. You do the Form 400, you fill out all the terms, you do the confirmation, the brokerage information, the deposit, everything that you do today, you do. But then somebody has to complete the lease. So who should complete the government lease? Should it be the tenant agent? Put your hands up. Or should it be just the landlord agent? Okay, so some people say, yeah, I see most of you are saying landlord agent. No, it's just, yeah, you just get that one handout over there. So most people, so it's the landlord. Does anybody missing a handout? Are you missing a handout? Can you, Sammy, can you give a handout? Okay, thank you. So, a couple more handouts, I think, at the back. Okay, so the big question is, can you add clauses to the government lease? The answer is yes. As long as the clauses are legal, you can add them to the government lease. So the most important today would be no cannabis. you know that the government is going to allow marijuana starting in October, and we're going to talk about it. You're going to be allowed to grow 4 plants in an apartment or a house. You're going to be allowed to smoke it. How many think that landlords should stop tenants from doing this? Right. So here I've given you in your material my no smoking, no marijuana clause. So I gave this to you as a gift. This comes from my own bunch of clauses to go into the government lease. But this will protect you for no smoking. If you want to take a picture, you can. But I've also given this to you in the handout. Now, yeah, I'm sorry? Yeah, we're going to talk about the government lease in a moment. How many of you would put this in the government lease? Yes or no? Yes, of course you would. Of course. You're allowed to add clauses to the government lease as long as they're not illegal. This is legal. This is important. And we're going to talk about marijuana, the second part of our course. Yes? We're going to talk about this in a minute. Here's another clause that I've added that basically says, you can take a picture of this too. I gave this to you, but this says that it's so important to the landlord that the plants, if you grow them in your house or apartment, they could damage the place, that you understand that you can't do this or the landlord will evict you. So this is another clause. It's not illegal. It can be added to the government lease. How many of you think it should be added to the government lease? Yes. Yes. Okay.
What happened if...
We'll talk. That's coming. Okay, number one, you see, if a tenant agent is preparing the government lease, are they going to include these clauses to protect the landlord? Yes or no? No. You understand? So that you've already been answered your question, who should prepare the government lease? Do you understand? Okay. Let's say you're renting out a condominium. Condominiums are now passing their own rules about cannabis. And so I've got a clause here that says the tenant will follow all the rules of the condominium. This will include all the no pet rules, because those are legal in a condominium. They're not legal in a house. No pets, unfortunately. But it also says they'll follow all the rules, so that covers cannabis too. Because all the corporate condominiums are passing rules now that says no cannabis as well. They're all trying to get ahead of October. So this is another clause, again, that should go into the government lease. Now, unfortunately, the government lease doesn't say anything about first and last month's rent. It just says you can only take last month's rent. You can't pay commission, HST, if you only have 1 month's rent. So I've got another clause that should go into the government lease, and this says that a deposit equal to 2 months' rent should be paid at the time of acceptance of the lease by the landlord. So how many of you like those clauses? Okay, so as I said, when you buy my landlord guide for only $20, you get 9 pages of my clauses. That includes a guarantee clause, no Airbnb, any clause that is legal that will protect a tenant. You get all that if you pick up my landlord guide. And my landlord guide answers all the questions you have about a tenant. So one of the questions I get asked all the time is, can you take 1 year rent in advance? Because a lot of tenants offer 1 year rent in advance. When I say 1 year rent in advance, I'm not talking post-dated checks. I'm talking, instead of $2,000 a month, they write a check for $24,000. You understand? They want to give you the whole. How many of you see this? Yes. So is this legal? I get a question. So it's complicated, is the answer. I write about this. You see, if a landlord or a landlord agent asks for 1 year, it's not legal. If the tenant offers it, it's legal. But do you see how tricky that is? Because I've seen a case at the board where the tenant offers a year in the lease. He writes in the offer, I offer 1 year rent in advance. And then he pays it and goes to the board and says, The only reason I put it in the lease is because the listing agent told me to. And if the judge there says, I agree, you have to give all the money back. You see the danger? And so it's very hard for me to give advice to people about taking 1 year rent in advance. Usually, if it's a foreign student, they're not going to make trouble. You understand? They just want to pay, go to school. Do you understand? But sometimes tenants like to make trouble. You have to be very careful. You can't put any text, any email, anything that says, well, you know, if you made your offer a little better. Do you understand? You can't do anything in writing that the judge could say, you asked for it. Do you understand? Yes. That's why this is hard. So you see, now let's look at, okay, is there a question just before we go forward? Yes?
Let's say if they pay 1 year rent up front, can they forego the interest?
No, they still get interest on the,
so
you have to pay interest on last month's rent. You always have to pay interest on last month's rent or any month that you take in advance. So some, you know, other questions people ask me on tenancies is how do you check pets? Because even if the landlord and tenant put in the lease no pets and the tenant brings 2 dogs into the house, the landlord cannot evict them. So they ask me, how do I protect the landlord? And so what I write is, there's a few tricks you learn. Number 1, don't speak to the landlord they have now. Speak to the one they used to have, because they'll tell you the truth. Mm-hmm. And you could ask them about pets. But otherwise, you have to get your 10-year-old or your 12-year-old to help you do the qualification. How come I say this? Because I would say to my 10-year-old, please check Facebook and Instagram, whatever the hell they do. Because if they have a dog, there'll be a picture of them smiling somewhere on Facebook with the dog. So that's how people check Facebook. Very important that you do that. I wrote this in an investment magazine for investors. Check Facebook. And a woman called me a few weeks later, and she said, I read your article. Okay, I rented my house in Hamilton 6 months ago. The tenant pays the rent, but I read your article, and I checked Facebook. And on Facebook, there was a picture of the woman with this humongous pig on a leash. So she said, is there a pig in my house? And she wasn't talking about the woman's husband. So I said, well, you're allowed to go check the house, give 24 hours notice, you're changing the batteries in the smoke alarm. She goes in the house, P.S., there is a pig in the house. So she called, she wasn't laughing. She called up hysterical to me, can I evict? And I said, I'm sorry, but I don't really know what the bylaw says in Hamilton. And in Hamilton, the bylaw says certain licensed pigs are allowed to be pets. This pig was licensed, and there's nothing she can do about it. So now you see, whenever a landlord calls me and complains to me and says, Mark, the tenant lied and brought a dog in my house, what I say is, be happy it's not a pig they brought in the house. I have something to say. Okay, so summary. If you're acting for a tenant today, all you do is the Form 400. Because you see, if the landlord doesn't give you the lease, and then the tenant asks for it later, the tenant can actually hold back a month's rent as a penalty if the landlord doesn't give it. So you see, there's no benefit really for the tenant to have it. So if you're just for the tenant, you do Form 400. But let's say the landlord agent says, I want you to do the government lease, okay? Which means the agent doesn't know what they're doing. You understand? They don't know what they're doing. So if they ask you to do it, you do it. But you're not going to add in a marijuana clause. You understand? All you're going to do is fill in the blanks of the rent, utilities, and send it back. But you see, if you're acting for the landlord, should you add in these extra clauses? What do you think? So you see, if you're acting for the landlord, then you're going to want to take look at my clauses. You have some I gave you for free. And put in as many clauses as you think you need. It could be 2 pages. It could be 3 pages. And then just like when you do an agreement of purchase and sale, you know, you put a Schedule B on MLS and you say for every buyer agent, put the Schedule B. How many of you do that? So that's what you're going to do with the government lease. You're going to say to the tenant agent, when you send me the Form 400, send me the government lease with these 3, 4, 5 pages attached. You get a package, you go to the landlord, you sign the offer, you sign the lease. One time, you're finished. How many of you like that idea? That's how you do the government lease from now on to make it easy. So before I move on, are there any questions just on the government lease based on what we've... do you understand that a little bit better? Okay, so are there any questions? Yes?
If we did the 400 already and I didn't put in this clause, can I add it in now?
See, the problem is... Yeah, so the question is, let's say, when did you do the 400?
After we signed the offer.
Yeah.
But the lease haven't commenced yet.
Yeah, but if you have not yet done the government lease, unfortunately, the government lease has to have the same clauses as the offer. You can't change it now. You see, that's why you can't really add these clauses now if they weren't in the Form 400 before.
Yeah, in the offer, I'm just saying no smoking, no marijuana.
If it was in the offer, you could put it in the government lease too.
Simply no smoking, no marijuana.
That's enough. That's enough. My clause is a little bit more detailed.
So I can still
But you can still put it in the government lease if it was in the Form 400. Very good. Okay, any other questions on the government lease? Yes?
Can tenants add any clause for themselves?
Can what? Tenant?
Yeah, add any clause to benefit for tenants. Like
Oh, can a tenant agent put in clauses to try to benefit the tenant?
Yes.
Nothing wrong with that, but they have to be legal clauses.
Like limitation for their tenants, for their improving, like the rental fee, something like that, for the landlord. Can tenants register a limitation for the rental improvement?
Rental increases?
Yeah.
No. You can't make any agreement about the rental increase. The rental increase is very low anyways. It's just 1.8% this year.
It's low, but
No, you can't make any agreement to make the rent increase more
like if
or less.
No, like they want to rent 2 years. Can they ask can they add a clause for the owner not to raise?
No, a clause where the owner says I won't raise the rent after 1 year is not legal, because the Act says you must be able to raise the rent. You can't make any clause that goes against the Act.
Okay, sorry, I'm still not clear for the previous example. Even if there is no pets in the offer, and the tenants they have pets later, right? So still cannot be evicted.
You can't evict somebody for having a pet.
Unless the condo rule doesn't allow.
Unless the condo rules say no pets, there's nothing you can do about pets unless you can prove the pet is bothering the other tenants. That's the only way you can evict for a pet. Yes?
So you said that the Schedule B that you prepared for the rental application, does it have to go to the Form 400 as well as the government?
Some people do it both ways. Some people say to the tenant agent, attach this to the Form 400 and the government lease. You understand? It doesn't matter. As long as it's there in the package, it's good.
Okay, even if it is just with the government lease?
It's good. Because you're getting them to sign everything at one time. That's the key.
How about the existing tenant?
How about?
They
Yeah,
were
for
there
existing
already.
tenants, you can't really add clauses. But we'll talk about how you evict cannabis people. That's a little later on today. Okay, this morning. So now I want to go to the next major topic, which goes towards selling a condominium with a tenant, or selling a home that is occupied by a tenant, because I get lots of questions about this. And the biggest problem for landlords is right here, that the most they can raise the rent this year is 1.8%, and it's going to be low next year. And even though you read in the papers that it says rents have gone up 10, 20, 30%, your landlords are complaining, well, my tenant's not paying 30% more, they're paying 30% less. And I can only raise, how many of you have landlords complaining to you? How many of you think this makes it hard to sell a house or condo when the tenant is paying below market rent? How many of you see? So you see, because of this, people always come to me and say, how do we get rid of the tenant before we list? You understand? And the only legal way, unfortunately, is to find the tenant another place to live and pay them to leave. Bribe. That's it.
Yeah.
People say, isn't there a 60-day notice? No. There's nothing you can do. So, because of that, landlords try to play tricks. And the only trick available right now is the family reason. How many of you understand the family reason? So the trick with the family reason is, oh, my kid is moving in to the condo, and then the tenant leaves. Oops, I made a mistake. We're selling it. Do you understand? That's family reasons. Well, you have to know no tenant believes this anymore. They fight this. But the government changed the laws on this about 6 months ago. And so the law says you still have to give 60 days notice. It has to be at the end of the lease. So let's say you're trying to sell a condo and the tenant has a lease till the end of January. Okay? You can't kick them out for the family reason till the end of next January. It has to be at the end of the lease. So you have to read the lease, very important. But let's say the tenant is month to month today, and you want to kick them out for the family reason. Today's July the 24th. So you have to kick them out at the end of a term. That's usually the end of the month. So the earliest you could evict somebody today, if they were month to month, for the family reason, is September 30th. So if you gave them notice today, my kid is moving in, the date has to be September 30th. You have to give 60 days notice. But it's not finished. You also have to give 1 month as a penalty. So now you have to pay this tenant. If it's $2,000 a month rent, you got to pay them an extra $2,000 to leave at the end of September. That law was changed 6 months ago.
Even for the year?
I'm not finished. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Anytime you use the family reason, you got to pay 1 month penalty. Now your kid, let's say, moves in September 1st or September 30th. They have to stay for 12 months. So let's say they don't stay for the whole 12 months. The penalty is $25,000. Plus, you have to pay all the tenant costs, rent increases for lying. So you see, it's not easy anymore to use the family reason. Trust me, I get calls from sellers and landlords and agents every day on this, and they don't like what I say. They say, Mark, how do I get rid of them? Pay them to leave. That's what I say. Because if you pay the tenant to leave, then they sign the N11. The N11 is the agreement to leave early. But they're not going to sign it unless you pay them money. Do you understand? I've made a lot of these negotiations with tenants. And I'm very careful. I say to the tenant, who's your lawyer? You know why? I pay the money to the lawyer, and he gets it when he leaves. I don't give him the money in advance. Then it's like, oh, I forgot, I'm not leaving, I want some more money. Do you understand? And so this is the problem you have today selling, because the tenant could just say to you, I'm not going. I don't care how much money, I'm not going. So now let's say today, you are selling a condominium in Toronto that has a tenant, but they're month to month. Okay, so let's just say you have a tenant month to month and you're trying to sell a condo. You know that you can't stage it. You can't do open houses. You got to give 24 hours notice. It's very hard to sell. But let's say you're willing to do that. Okay, so there are 3 possibilities for a buyer. See, when you list this property with a tenant, you have 3 buyers who could come and see you. The first buyer says, I will accept the tenant. In other words, the tenant is paying good rent. This is an investor, and the investor says, I'll take over the tenant. That's the best buyer for you, right? That's the best buyer. Tenant gets to stay, they pay the rent, you're happy. The second buyer, not so good. The second buyer says, no, I'm an investor, but this tenant is paying below market rent, so I want you to give me vacant possession. Vacant possession means that I can rent it to somebody else for more money. Now, that's not going to be easy now. But this is a second buyer that you could get. Do you understand? The third buyer says, I have a daughter who's going to Ryerson, and I need that condo so that she can move in and go to Ryerson. So really, this is like the family reason that the buyer needs the place on closing. So we have 3 possible buyers. So for the first buyer, that's easy. You just say in the contract, tenant will be accepted by the buyer. Simple. For the second buyer, it's more complicated because they want vacant possession and the tenant is there. So you see, if this offer comes in, the only way you can accept it is if you say it's conditional on making a deal with the tenant. Do you understand? You see, the seller agent now, you give yourself a week. Let's say you got a really good offer, $30,000 over asking. So you say, okay, we're going to make the deal conditional. You're going to go talk to the tenant. Maybe you offer the tenant $10,000 to go away. Right? So you try to make a deal. If you make a deal, you close the deal. You don't make a deal, you can't close. You understand? Because do you see why it has to be conditional?
Yes.
It has to be conditional because no notice works here. So that's the only way you can do this deal. Make it conditional on making a deal with the seller, with the tenant. Now, the third situation, remember, the daughter's moving in. So the good news with this, it's a family reason, there's no compensation. So you see, when a buyer is moving in, we do not have to pay 1 month's rent to the tenant. We still have to give 60 days notice. Do you understand? Now, so let's say we do that. So let's say you sign a deal today and you give notice to the tenant to leave at the end of September. You got to give 60 days notice. And you say the reason is the buyer's daughter is moving in. Well, let's say the tenant leaves and the buyer's daughter does not move in. Instead, the buyer doubles the rent for another tenant. Is that possible?
Yes.
What can the tenant do then? If the buyer really tricks the seller, what can the tenant do? They can sue the seller. Because remember, it's the seller that gives the notice to the tenant, not the buyer. So you see, now the seller could get a penalty and they didn't do anything wrong. Do you understand that? So there has to be something to protect the seller. And so this is the clause that comes from my landlord guide. I gave it to you as well. But this is the clause you add in to protect your seller and make sure they follow the rules. So what this says is that the buyer is moving in on closing. And then it says the seller will give the 60-day notice on behalf of the buyer, because the reason has to be the buyer is moving in. then it goes on to say that the buyer will give any support information. So this could mean an affidavit to prove they're moving in, or maybe even to testify if necessary. And it goes on to say that the buyer will indemnify the seller if the seller suffers damages because the buyer didn't stay there for 1 year after closing. So you see, if the buyer tries to trick and the seller gets sued by the tenant, then the buyer has to pay the penalty. You understand? That's what this means. Now, later I put that if the tenant is not gone by the closing date, then you have to extend closing for 30 days. If you have to take longer to get rid of the tenant. But if the tenant is still not gone after 30 days, then you have a decision to make. This says that the buyer can accept the tenant or cancel the deal. And I know you don't like a buyer to be able to cancel the deal last minute, but I know from practice, many lenders will not give the money if there's a tenant. They're giving the money for buyers to move in, not to have a tenant. So you see the problem. So let me explain to you how I handle this with the agent if I'm the lawyer. So I had to do 3 of these last summer. Same kind of deals. And so in all of them, let's say you were signing today and the tenant is month to month. So we figure out, okay, you have to give the 60-day notice to the end of September, close the deal the first week of October. So you close the deal October 5th, October 6th. Then we serve the 60-day notice to the tenant, saying you have to get out September 30th. A week later, 2 weeks later, I say to the agent, go talk to the tenant and see if they're leaving. So 2 weeks later, I had a few of these last summer. In one of them, the agent went to talk to the tenant and said, so we gave you the notice, have you found another place? And the tenant said, I found another place, I'm leaving. And the agent told me they saw boxes and the person was getting ready to move. So I said, okay, let's wait, we'll close the deal. And we closed the deal. But on the 2 other ones, when the agent went to speak to the tenant, what did the tenant say? This is a trick. I don't believe you. I'm not going anywhere. So you see, I already knew 2 weeks later that the tenant was not leaving. And so I went to a paralegal because I use paralegals to help me with landlord and tenant stuff. And whenever you ask me about a tenant, I usually will say use this paralegal because they're cheaper than using lawyers and they're there every day, so they know how to do this. So I say to the paralegal, let's say we were doing this now. I say in the beginning of August, I want you to go and get a hearing in front of the board because it takes usually a month to get in front of the board. So they make a hearing. Let's say you did the deal today. The hearing would be the first week of September. So who comes to that hearing? Well, the buyer has to come. So the daughter has to come with her admission to Ryerson to say to the judge, I'm moving in and I'm going to Ryerson. The seller comes and says, I have the agreement of purchase and sale. I have to sell. And the tenant comes and says, they're all liars. Okay, but that's the trial. You have to have a trial. So at the trial that we had last summer, in both cases, the judge said, I believe the buyer and the seller. The tenancy will terminate September 30. Now, you see, we couldn't terminate earlier because the 60-day notice is September 30th. But we needed a judge to say the tenant must leave September 30th. So one of the tenants, once we won, they left. But the other tenant said, I'm not going anywhere. Now, the only person who can evict a tenant is the sheriff. And normally it takes 3 to 4 weeks from the termination date to get the sheriff. So, of course, I sent a letter to the tenant saying, if you don't go, we're going to go to the sheriff. Physically, they're going to kick you out, and you're going to pay damages because the buyer can't move in and the seller's suffering a loss. P.S. The day after the deal was supposed to close, we heard that the tenant had reserved the elevator and just disappeared. And so we were able to close a day later. The buyer went in first to do an inspection to make sure there was no damages, and we were able to close. So you see, what's the moral of the story? It's not easy to close these deals, but that's the way you do it. And otherwise, as I said earlier, find the tenant another place to live and pay them to go away. This is not fun, but it'll make your life easier. Okay, so I think that is all I wanted to say on this. Before I take questions, I did want to just say one thing about turning down a tenant. People always ask me, how do I say no to a tenant? Because if you say no to a tenant and you say the wrong thing, they can say that you're discriminating against them. How many of you have heard of this? That it's because of their race, religion, color. And I heard of one case at the Human Rights Board where somebody was fined, a landlord, $5,000 because they wouldn't rent to a single mother with 3 teenage boys. And the landlord said, well, teenage boys are going to wreck my place. She got $5,000 because that was called discrimination based on family status. So you see how careful you have to be with the words. So this comes from my landlord guide. This is what you say to a tenant. We preferred another tenant. That's all you say. It's wonderful. But if you don't have another tenant, we're still reviewing applications. How many of you like those answers? Yes, that's what you say. And you don't have to say anything more, and you're not discriminating against anybody. This also comes from my landlord guide as well. Okay, so before we move down to cannabis, that's our next topic, marijuana. Are there any questions on this? First of all, do you understand it a little bit better? Okay, are there questions? Yes.
Can you ask for photo IDs when they present offer?
Yes, you can ask for photo ID when they present an offer. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, the more information you ask for, the better it is. Okay, so you should always not be afraid to ask for information. Yes?
Say if the landlord already know they were moving back after 1 year, can we put that on the lease agreement, the clause? So after 12 months, the tenant and the landlord already agree upon the issue that the tenant will move out.
No. No,
illegal.
you can't agree at the beginning that the tenant will move out at the end. It's not legal. You can't do those agreements in advance.
Okay.
Good question, but you can't. Yes?
So when the lease is mature, like 1 year, it's automatically month to month?
Yes. It becomes automatic month to month. This is what landlords drives them crazy. Month to month means there's no termination unless you have the family reason or the buyer's moving in. You see, it's very hard.
What if the tenant promised to leave
Doesn't matter.
and they don't leave?
Okay, so let's say that the tenant signed the N11. There's no verbal promises. Let's say they signed the N11 that says, I'm leaving. So let's say they signed at the end of July. I'm leaving. August 1st, they're still there. You take the N11, that's why it has to be signed, and a good paralegal, they just send it right to the board, and you can get an eviction order without a hearing, as long as you have the N11. And then you would take that eviction order, takes about a week, right to the sheriff. So it's faster to evict, but you still have to do that. But this is why I don't pay the tenant any money. I pay it to the lawyer. Most of the time. Although sometimes I'm afraid. You see, sometimes I'm afraid if I tell them to go to a lawyer, the lawyer will say charge 10 times as much. You understand? So sometimes I speak to the landlord and I say, maybe it's better if you just pay them the check and get them out. Do you understand? because lawyers put ideas into people's heads. Yes. Yes.
How do you know how much to pay the tenants?
Yeah, so see, the problem when you ask me, how much should I pay a tenant as a deal today? There's no rules. You know why there's no rules? Because how is the vacancy rate in Toronto right now? It's almost impossible to find a place to live. I used to say, pay the tenant's moving cost and 1 year difference in rent for a similar place. They're paying you $2,000, they can get for $2,300, pay 300 times 12 plus moving costs. That's what I used to say. Now, the more tenants learn how much power they have, they can ask for anything. Do you understand? That's the problem. That's the problem.
Does this rule just to the metro Toronto area or all?
The whole province of Ontario. This rule is the whole province of Ontario. Yes?
Yeah, let's see. The landlord only want the rent for a whole year, like the girl asks. And can I sign the offer to lease and sign the N11 at the same time?
No, it's a good idea. Let's sign the N11 when we sign the lease. Oh, no, and people used to do this, but then they changed the law to say if you sign an N11, when you sign the lease, void.
N11 actually have that stated.
Yeah, it's right here. It's a good idea. That's why the government had to change the law. Okay, yes, back there. Speak loud.
At the end of your 1 year lease, can you get your tenant to, instead of them, their lease turning into a month-to-month, can you do another lease?
So the question is, can a landlord and tenant sign for another year?
Right.
If both agree, they could sign for another year. If one does not agree, then it's automatically month to month. So you can agree for another year. But I do want to say to you, if you act for a landlord, please do not put renewal clauses in the lease. How many of you know what a renewal clause is?
The tenant has the option to.
Okay, because let me explain a lease that somebody sent to me. So this is what the lease said. At the end of the lease, 1 year, the tenant can, as long as the tenant gives 60 days notice, the tenant can renew the lease for 1 more year on the same terms.
Oh, so that keeps.
So what does the same terms mean? Another renewal. This means they could renew it forever. Do you understand? I read this and I said to the owner, you can't kick them out. Do you understand? You can't kick them out. Whether you want to move in, doesn't matter. It's renewable forever. The only way was to write a big check. But do you see the danger? That's the danger when you don't write a renewal the right way. You're supposed to say that only 1 renewal term. Do you understand? And so instead of making a mistake, just don't put it in. Then you won't make a mistake. You understand? Trust me on this. I don't want you to make a mistake because you see that agent who wrote that clause could get sued now for negligence. Do you understand? So you can't do that. Okay, in the far back, yes.
If the current lease, the tenant offers the first month and last 3 months, so how do the landlord keep it going after the first year?
So when the tenant, first of all, an offer of the first month and the last 3 months is not legal, but that's besides the point. So how the landlord, deals with that is up to the landlord. So you see, at the end of, many landlords just say, okay, at the end of the first year, I'll use the 3 months. Some landlords will say, well, if you're still staying, I'm going to keep holding it for the last 3 months till you finally leave. In my experience, most landlords take it for the last few months of the first year. That's usually what they do. Okay, so I know you may have other questions, but I want to finish the material. You can always email me questions. You have my business card. I will be if you didn't get my business card, you can come up. Also, I have videos that I send out once or twice a month, And if you want to be on my email list, just drop a business card over by that green bag in the corner on your way out. Just drop a business card with an email, and I'll put you on my email list, and you'll get my emails. And if you ever have a question, just email it to me. I'm happy to answer all your questions. Okay, so now we're going to switch to cannabis, because the law is changing in October, and I've already been giving seminars to boards all over Ontario, and so I'm going to give you a quick update on what is coming so you're familiar with this. And it'll include how to evict a tenant, whether you have a clause or not in your offer. So the way I try to make this easy for people is just think of the laws that we have today for alcohol and cigarettes. Okay? When you're driving your car, can you have an open bottle of liquor beside you in the coffee holder?
No.
Yes or no? No. You know this. Same thing. You can't have a cannabis cigarette when you drive a car. Do you understand? If you're in a restaurant, can you take a cigarette out and start smoking? No, you can get a fine. Same thing, you can't take a cannabis cigarette out. So the laws are going to allow this, but they're going to treat it like we treat alcohol and cigarettes today. So you have to understand that. And so we're just going to add cannabis. So think about it. Can you drive a car impaired by alcohol? No. Can you drive a car and text, which is like being impaired? No. Same thing. You're not going to be able to drive a car with cannabis, like high on cannabis. The police have tests they're developing on saliva to test if you have cannabis in your system. So it can be impaired driving. So what will be permitted? So you have to understand the rules. In public, if you're caught and you're holding 30 grams of cannabis in a bag, that's legal if you're an adult. Adult in Canada means 18 or over. Ontario, it's 19. But if you, instead of 30 grams in a plastic, you have 30 packages of 1 gram, you could get in trouble. Because then it looks like you're dealing cannabis. Do you understand? Now let's say you had 50 grams in a plastic pouch. You could get a ticket for maybe $300, $500. You understand? But if it's a lot more, then you could start getting potentially criminal charges. And this is the big one. The government of Canada has said that everybody can grow 4 plants in their residence. Residence could be a house, a condominium, or an apartment. This is across Canada. And as well, it includes the backyard. So if you have a house with a backyard, according to the government of Canada, you will be able to grow 4 plants either inside the house or in the garden. How many of you think that in the garden is better than in the house? Okay, a realtor would think so, because then the house is not getting damaged. But still, how many people would like their neighbors to be growing 4 plants, everybody in the back? How many think you're going to be able to smell this stuff? Do you understand? I thought I only had to worry about raccoons in the summertime. Now we're going to have all these people running into backyards stealing cannabis plants. Or maybe we plant them for the raccoons, so they'll eat them and then we will be easier to trap them. Maybe, I don't know. So we will be able to buy the cannabis cigarettes and grow the plants for cigarettes, but we are not allowing yet the other products of the cannabis plant. So all these oils that go into cannabis brownies or other edibles or products, you cannot buy those legally after October 16th. Now, if you're a medical cannabis person, you already have the right to buy these products. You know, and it's funny, I just came back from New York. I was visiting my daughter there, And so many stores I pass are all, it says smoke, vape, and these edible cannabis lotions and stuff. Already, once this becomes legal, you're going to see these stores everywhere. Everywhere. But right now, it's not allowed to buy. But, you know, it's funny that for a landlord, edibles are better. They are. They're better. Because if somebody's eating a cannabis brownie in their apartment, it's not bothering the neighbor. But if they're smoking the cannabis, it's bothering everybody else. So you see, the funny thing is, most people will tell the government to make this quicker. But I read in the paper this morning, poor thing, did you read in the paper this morning, a 4-year-old saw a chocolate bar in the father's car. It was a cannabis bar. And she ate the whole chocolate bar, and they had to take her to emergency. You know, he was looking at his own daughter, and she's all kinds of loopy. She's 4 years old. Now you see the danger of this stuff. That's why the government needs to study this more. So this is going to come, they say a year from now, you'll be able to buy a cannabis brownie. But you see, we laugh, but you see, for me, the brownie's better than a cigarette. Because the cigarette is, first of all, I can't stand the smell. You can't stand the smell, etc. Okay. Still, medical cannabis users are going to be able to do what they do today. So if you need medical cannabis, but you see, what people have to understand is just because you have a doctor's letter that says you can have cannabis for medical reasons, you cannot show up to work high on cannabis. Do you understand? You could be fired if you come to work and you're high on cannabis. Do you understand? You can't do that. You can't take advantage. And so even though cannabis folks can have more on them, they can grow more, they can't take advantage of everybody else. That's important. Because you see, on the one hand, we're going to have rights of landlords. On the other hand, we're going to have rights of human rights of cannabis people who have medical requirements. So you see, this is going to be the big problem. Okay. So the federal government has a bill that's coming. So this is the new government law that, and really, the federal government is looking at cannabis the way they look at cigarettes. Think about cigarettes today. Is it, you know, they're available, but they're not like on the rack when you walk into the store. They're not with fancy displays. They're behind the counter. It's hard to see them. You have to ask for them, and they give it to you. Why do they have to do that? Because the government puts these restrictions. Why? They don't want kids to see this. They don't want kids to be attracted to cigarettes. And you know what? I don't know if it's studies I read or whatever, but it seems like the number of kids you read getting addicted to cigarettes seems to go down every year. Because it seems like what the government is doing, you know, yeah, they tax it, they make money, but kids don't seem to be that attracted to it. So they're going to restrict cannabis the same way. If you're an adult, go buy it, but it's not going to be easy. It's going to be in the back somewhere. Do you understand? It's not going to be out front that people can buy it easily. And so they're going to regulate the production. So people have to get licenses, how they're going to produce this stuff. And the goal is to stop, this is the Canadian government, under 18 from getting cannabis. So they're going to spend a lot of money from taxes and everything on educating kids not to smoke or use cannabis. Provinces can raise the age limit. This is why in Ontario you have to be 19. The same way you have to be 19 to have a drink in this province. Quebec, you only have to be 18. So kids in Quebec will be able to smoke cannabis when they're 18. But they'll have to be 19 here in Ontario. And there'll also be the same restrictions on packaging, marketing, sponsorships related to cannabis. Because they're not going to want to make it attractive to kids to do this. And if you are selling to children, you can actually be thrown in jail for 14 years if you're selling cannabis to kids. Now, let me just explain to you just, you know, a consequence of this. Many of you will know people who are here as permanent residents. The law for a permanent resident in Canada says if you do something wrong where the maximum penalty is 14 years or more than 10 years, you can be deported. So you see, if a permanent resident breaks one of these cannabis laws about selling to kids, even if they just get a fine for $500, they could be deported because the maximum penalty is 14 years. So you have to be so careful about this if you're a permanent resident. And the reason the government says they're doing this is to try to reduce the burden on criminal justice. Like if we're not spending money on the police chasing these people, maybe that money would be better spent on educating kids and maybe dealing with all the gun problems we have in this city. That would be a better use of money than this. And so I hope that's what the government does with the money they save on this. I don't make this policy. Whether you agree with it or not, it's the law. Starting October, you just have to know how to deal with it. Okay, the province here in Ontario said already you have to be 19. They're going to have a few stores. Now, I think there's going to be 3 cannabis stores in the GTA. Can you imagine if we had 3 liquor stores in the GTA? The lineups you would have to buy liquor. So it's not going to be friendly. And maybe this is why the government decided to allow people to grow 4 plants in their homes, because it's just going to be so hard to get it for the first few years. The government of Ontario is also allowing 4 plants, but what they haven't decided yet is will they allow plants to be grown in a garden. So they're still working that out. We'll find out before October whether the government in Ontario will also allow plants to be grown in the garden. And in smoke-free, cannabis is going to be there, and they're going to change the impaired driving laws to also include cannabis. So, as I said earlier, right now, somebody can smoke cannabis in their apartment or on the balcony. That's what it says right now. And, but you can't do it in public. So you're not allowed to do this in a restaurant. You can't do it in the elevator in your apartment. You can't do it in common areas, the same way you can't smoke today. But medical cannabis is something else. And so condominiums have already started trying to deal with medical cannabis. In some, they say we're going to designate an area outside the building where you have to go smoke cannabis. That's what some condos are doing. Or they can do other restrictions on medical cannabis users. And we'll talk about those restrictions in a couple minutes. So again, smoking in restaurants today is not allowed. It'll be the same with cannabis. And it's also changed to the law. The police can actually remove every adult from a residence if they're growing more than 4 plants. So if more than 4 plants are being grown in somebody's place, that's still a grow-up, and the police can now remove all the adults from the premises. Okay, so the biggest problem right now is going to be condominiums. Whether you live in a condominium, own a condominium, or rent a condominium to a tenant. And so condominium boards all across Ontario are trying to figure out how are they going to deal with cannabis. So they have 3 choices. One is to change the declaration. Now that's almost impossible because it takes 80% of the owners. The second, which is being done by 95%, is to change the rules. So to change a rule, the directors can pass a rule. If the owners don't challenge it, it's done within 30 days. So that is what most condominiums are doing today. They're passing new rules about cannabis. The third way is to do nothing. So what do I mean by do nothing? The condominium can just go after anybody that's bothering somebody else. Like you can't use your condominium today in a way that bothers other people. So if you're smoking and it's bothering your neighbor, the board can force you to stop. So some condominiums are not going to do anything. They're just going to try to stop people from bothering their neighbors. But what I've seen is more people are doing the rule. And so what people are doing today in condominiums is they're saying, you know what? Why don't we make the whole building smoke-free? So this is what they're saying. Starting today, no cannabis, no growing plants of cannabis. And also, no more cigarette smoking in any unit. These are rules that are being passed today. But the problem the condominiums have is there are some owners or tenants who've already been smoking, you understand, in the unit. So what they do then is they have grandfathering. So what they do in the rule is they say, if you're smoking today in your unit, you have to tell us within a month, and then you could smoke until you sell your unit, and then it's smoke-free. Do you understand? Or if it's a tenant smoking and the lease ends, so does the smoking. So eventually they're turning the building into what? Completely smoke-free. But it will be for sure no cannabis and no growing cannabis plants. That's what they're doing. So then they have to deal with the medical cannabis. So this is what they're doing. So what they're saying for medical cannabis is wonderful. This is what they're saying. If you're a medical cannabis person and you need this stuff, you have to go and get a note from a doctor in Ontario that says that you cannot be cured with the edible cannabis. Remember the edible? So a doctor has to say, because isn't it better for a condominium if you're using the edible? Yes, so you have to go to a doctor to say that the edible and the oils and all these lotions cannot help this person medically. They must have a cannabis cigarette. So that's number one you have to do. Number two, if you have to make the stuff or smoke the stuff in your unit, you have to prove to us that you've put in proper ventilation and exhaust so that what? The smoke doesn't go into another unit. And so to me, this is a balance between the human rights of somebody and the condominium that wants to protect all the other units as well. So this is what they're doing. They're saying, and first of all, why do you have to make it? Can't you buy it? Do you understand? You have to prove to us that you can't buy it before we allow you to make it inside your unit. So this is what condominiums are doing. You see, they want to go smoke-free and medical. So you see today, already, when I review a status certificate, you know, one of the things I always check the rules about pets, and I say to people, you know, you can have a pet, but it can't be more than 30 pounds. I tell people. Now I say, they have a no smoking rule now. If you smoke cigarettes, you're out of luck because you're not grandfathered. Do you understand? If you're a smoker, you can't go into this building because they've become non-smoking. You have to watch that now. Buildings are becoming no smoking. So you have to watch that and explain that to your people. So this is how condominiums are dealing with it. And to me, we get a lot of clues about this for ourselves. And this leads us maybe to the biggest problem realtors and owners are going to have: insurance. Okay, now, how many of you think that if somebody starts growing cannabis in their basement, even if it's for plants, it could increase the risk of damage to somebody's property? Put your hands up. Cannabis is a very moisture, plant. Does moisture possibly lead to mold that leads to damage? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, we know this. And so there's a rule in the insurance industry that the minute you know that your risk has gone up, you have to tell the insurance company. So as an example, if you're renting the basement apartment for the first time, even if it is a legal basement apartment, it complies with electrical safety and fire. Do you understand? It's legal. You have to disclose this to your insurance company because once you have two families living in the same place, the risk went up. If you don't disclose this to the insurance company and then you have a flood in the roof, which is not even related to the basement apartment, you're not covered. You're not covered. Why? The risk went up. So you see, If you don't disclose this to the insurance company and something happens, you're not going to be covered. Now, the insurance company, as you know, they usually send a questionnaire once a year saying, when your policy comes due, we have a questionnaire for you to sign, because they want to know what's going on in the property. And so when I was speaking to an insurance underwriter, they said that today, everybody gets asked, do you have a trampoline in your backyard? Why do the insurance companies ask that today when you renew insurance? Because they've paid out too much money with kids getting crippled on those stupid trampolines. So now you see, if you tell the insurance company we have a trampoline, what are they going to say? You're not covered. And if you lie and somebody gets hurt, you're not covered. So you can bet soon there's going to be a question on the policies that say, are you growing cannabis in your home? And if you say yes, then the insurance company's probably going to say, well, prove to us this is safe. Just like the basement apartment. Do you have a professional electrician, ventilation equipment? Do you understand? To stop mold. If you do, they'll probably cover you. If you don't, they'll say you're not covered for any mold damage. So you see already, the insurance, I can see the insurance industry sticking their noses. So all landlords are going to have to check their properties regularly to make sure the tenants are not growing this stuff. Lenders, same thing. You think the banks are going to care if you have cannabis plants in the house? Yes, they're going to care too. This is going to be questions on refinances. Do you have cannabis growing in the house? Can you grow cannabis safely? Yeah, I suppose if you have a professional electrician and a ventilation system, there are already systems you can buy online, I think for $500 to $1,000, that it's like it enclosed. And they claim that it won't damage the walls. Who knows? But do you understand? There's already things that people can buy. So, to me, you're going to expect a mess of mold. Now, before we get to the listing, you asked me about evicting a tenant. If the tenant is smoking cannabis or growing, and you didn't put it in your lease, you will have to prove that the growing cannabis is causing mold behind the walls to kick the tenant out. You're going to have to prove it, that what they're doing is damaging your property, or if you're renting out an apartment in a triplex or fourplex, you have to prove that the smoke is bothering the other tenants. So if you can prove that, you can evict the tenant who smokes cannabis after this. But if you have it in the lease, it's easier because then they knew about it before they moved in. So listing. So when you go on a listing after October, then the question is, does the seller have to tell you about cannabis plants? So let's say the seller took them out before listing. Now, what questions do you have to ask the seller? So, let's go over the laws of disclosure. I wrote the laws of disclosure and put the pen down. And everything I wrote then is still the law today. So, if you walk into a house, any defect you can see with your eyes that's visible does not have to be disclosed. That's a patent defect. So if the window's cracked, if the window doesn't open, if there's a hole behind the picture and you didn't check, you don't have to disclose that to a buyer. Let's say there's asbestos insulation, but it's visible. You don't have to disclose it to a buyer because it's visible. And that's why sometimes it's important to have that home inspection because the inspector can see things. So that's a patent defect. If it's hidden, meaning like a flood or a foundation problem, or mold behind the walls. If it's major and the seller knows about it, they have to disclose it to the buyer. So if the seller knows about a hidden defect, like a flood, or foundation, or mold, they have to disclose it. So you see, if the cannabis has caused mold and the seller knows about it, then it has to be disclosed. But I'll bet you most sellers will not disclose this. I already know most sellers are not going to disclose this. And then I have another question. If you have a cannabis plant in the garden next spring, is it a chattel or a fixture? But you see, that's an important question. If it's in the ground, how many sellers take the flower beds? So you see, trust me, you're going to list the cannabis plants if the seller wants to take them, so that you don't have a fight about it later. But if they're planted in the ground, you could probably make the argument it's a fixture. If it's in a potted plant, it's a chattel. But rather than fight about it, make sure you list this in your contract. And now let's talk. I have a clause here. This is my last slide. And so let me go back to the disclosure for a second. People always ask me about suicides or murders. There was a case that came out in March, and in that case it was very interesting. There was a murder on the property, it wasn't disclosed. And the judge said that if you would have Googled the property address, you would have seen murder. He said that's a patent defect. Remember what patent defect means? No disclosure. He basically said sellers do not have to disclose suicides or murders. They do not, meaning that the realtor does not have to disclose it. But if they ask you, was there a murder or suicide, you have to tell the truth, if you know. But you don't have to disclose it. So how many of you now are seeing clauses in contracts that says the seller represents and warrants no suicide, murder, or illegal grow-up? How many of you see that? That's why you see it. Because if it's in there, the seller has to tell the truth. You understand? He doesn't have to, or she doesn't have to disclose, but they have to tell the truth. That's why you have to put the clause in, and that's why you're going to put these kinds of clauses after October, that the seller is also telling you they did not grow any cannabis plants, because they may not have to disclose this, because they could say there's no mold. If there's no mold, I don't have to disclose. So you don't be troubled by it. Just put the clause in there, and that's how you'll see maybe clauses with suicide, murders, grow-ups, cannabis. You'll have it all together. That's okay too. So because you can't trust sellers, I always say to people that it's important to Google the property address, every property you're interested in. Also, if you have time, and in a balanced market you have more time, tell the seller to walk up and down the street and speak to the neighbors about the house you're buying. And they should ask, first, have there been any repair trucks to that house in the past year? Have you seen the basement flood? Because the seller may not tell you this. Neighbors will tell you the truth. Two, ask them if there's any other stigma associated with the house. Because I know that many of your clients will care about a suicide or murder or death in the house. You will. So you got to ask. And finally, you should ask about the neighbors on both sides of the house. Because many sellers move because of fights with the neighbors, and they'll never tell the buyer. And you won't get a referral if your buyer buys a house and they have a crazy neighbor next door. So this is the kind of protection you can do, but also Google the property address that you're interested in always. Takes 2 minutes, but you can find things out by doing that way. So, I think that brings to the end of the seminar. Did you learn something this morning? Yes. Thank you. So just a couple of things. So just a reminder, because I know you'll be going out. If anybody wants to pick up, what did you need? Just the booklet.